There was a locked door in my husband's house that he told me, on our wedding day, I would never need to open. My name is Ivy. I'm 32, and I married a quiet, careful man named Thomas 18 months ago, moving into a beautiful old house on the edge of Savannah that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. I didn't think much about that locked door at first. Every old house has a room full of forgotten things. I told myself it was nothing. Thomas was not a mysterious man in any obvious way. He was gentle, predictable, the kind of steady presence that made me feel safe after years of chaotic relationships before him. He worked as an architect, kept a careful schedule, and rarely raised his voice about anything. The only strange thing about him, the only thing that never quite fit the rest of the picture, was that door at the end of the upstairs hallway, always locked, key never visible. Subject always gently redirected whenever I brought it up. "It was my mother's study," he told me once, early in our marriage. "I haven't been able to clear it out since she passed. Give me time." I gave him time. 18 months of time, actually, which felt like more than enough patience for one closed door in an otherwise open marriage. But patience has a way of curdling into curiosity when you live 20 feet away from a locked room every single day. It started with small things. Thomas began disappearing for an hour or two most evenings, always with some explanation, checking on a work project, taking a walk to clear his head. I never heard the door open when I was downstairs, but I started noticing things afterward. A faint scent of old paper and dust on his clothes. A particular tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before dinner. Once I found a single brass key sitting on his nightstand that vanished by morning, and when I asked him about it, he simply said, "Just an old key. Doesn't fit anything anymore," in a tone that discouraged further questions. I told myself I trusted him completely. I told myself that a locked room was a small thing to overlook in an otherwise good marriage. But the human mind doesn't work in straight lines, and mine had started keeping quiet track of every strange detail, whether I wanted it to or not. 3 weeks ago, everything changed. Thomas left for a 3-day architecture conference in Atlanta, something he'd done twice before without incident. I drove him to the airport myself, kissed him goodbye, told him to call when he landed. And then I drove home to an empty house that suddenly felt entirely different than it had 18 months earlier. I stood outside that locked door for nearly 20 minutes before I let myself admit what I was actually considering. Every rational part of me argued against it. This was his private space, his grief, his right to process his mother's memory however he needed to. But another part of me, quieter and more insistent, kept whispering that 18 months was a long time to grieve behind a locked door, and that grief doesn't typically require hiding brass keys or vanishing every evening with tension in your shoulders. You didn't have before dinner. I found a spare key in an old jewelry box Thomas kept in our closet, one I'd never had reason to open before. My hands were shaking as I turned it in that lock, half expecting it not to fit, almost hoping it wouldn't. It fit perfectly. The door swung open into a room that made my breath catch immediately, though not for the reason I'd braced myself for. It wasn't his mother's old study, dusty with abandoned furniture and forgotten belongings. It was completely renovated, clean, organized, clearly used regularly. One wall was covered entirely with architectural blueprints, dozens of them, meticulously pinned in neat rows. Another wall held photographs, hundreds of them, all of the same building, an old Victorian house I didn't recognize, photographed from every possible angle across what looked like several years. In the center of the room stood a large wooden model, incredibly detailed, of that exact same house, painted with careful precision down to the smallest architectural details. A small brass plaque on the model's base read, "Whitmore House Restoration, Estand Completion, Spring." My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but every instinct told me this wasn't nothing. This was something Thomas had spent significant time and money building in complete secrecy, hidden behind a locked door for the entire length of our marriage. I found a folder on the small desk near the window, thick with paperwork. Property deeds. Construction permits. Financial statements from an account I didn't recognize, one that wasn't part of our joint finances. And beneath all of that, a stack of letters, handwritten, addressed to someone named Caroline. My hands were shaking uncontrollably now as I opened the first letter, my mind already racing toward the worst possible explanation, the one every instinct was screaming at me to prepare for. Another woman, a secret life. Everything I thought I knew about my careful, quiet, predictable husband dissolving in real time inside that hidden room. The letter began, "Dear Caroline, I know you can't read this, but I write to you anyway, the same way I've written every month since you left us." I sat down slowly on the small wooden chair near the desk, reading through letter after letter, my understanding shifting completely with every paragraph. Caroline wasn't another woman. Caroline was Thomas's younger sister, someone he'd never once mentioned to me in 18 months of marriage, someone who had died at 19 years old, in a house fire 12 years earlier, the same Whitmore house pictured in every photograph covering that wall. The letters detailed a story I'd never heard, one Thomas had apparently carried entirely alone. Caroline had died in a fire that started because of faulty electrical wiring the family had known about but couldn't afford to fix at the time. Thomas had been away at college when it happened, had spent the 12 years since consumed by guilt he'd never once mentioned to me. Guilt so heavy he'd secretly purchased the burned remains of that house years earlier, and had been slowly, privately restoring it as some kind of penance. A tribute he'd never told a single living person about, not even his own wife. I heard the front door open downstairs before I could process everything I'd just discovered. Thomas was home, a full day early. I froze in that room, letters still scattered across my lap, completely unprepared for the conversation I now had no way of avoiding. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy, and I understood, with a sinking dread, that he already somehow knew I was up here. He appeared in the doorway, and the expression on his face wasn't anger, which somehow made everything worse. It was something closer to devastation, like watching someone witness a wound reopening in real time. "You found it," he said quietly. Not a question. "Thomas, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have," I started, but he simply shook his head slowly, walking further into the room, running his hand gently along the edge of the wooden model like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "I was going to tell you eventually," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just didn't know how. Every time I tried, I couldn't find the words that made any of it sound like something other than what it actually is. A grown man who spent 12 years talking to his dead sister like she can still hear him." "Why didn't you tell me about Caroline at all?" I asked, my own voice shaking now, still processing the sheer weight of everything I'd just learned. 18 months, Thomas. You never once mentioned you even had a sister." He sat down heavily on the floor near the model, his composure finally breaking in a way I'd genuinely never witnessed in our entire relationship. "Because the moment I say her name out loud to someone new, she becomes a story I tell people. A sad fact about my past. And I couldn't stand the thought of her becoming that. Some tragic detail people offer sympathy about at dinner parties before moving on to the next topic. In here, she's still just my sister. I still get to be the person who's rebuilding something for her, instead of the person who couldn't save her. I moved to sit beside him on that floor, my earlier panic slowly giving way to a grief I hadn't expected to feel for a woman I'd never known existed until 20 minutes earlier. "You've been grieving alone for 12 years, I said softly. "And for the 18 months we've been married, you kept grieving alone, right next to me, without ever letting me carry any of it with you." "I didn't know how to let anyone in," he admitted, his voice cracking completely now. "My parents couldn't even say her name after it happened. We just stopped talking about her entirely, like pretending she never existed would somehow hurt less. I started this restoration because I needed somewhere her memory could still exist, even if it was somewhere completely hidden from the rest of my life." We sat in that room together for hours that night, Thomas finally telling me everything about Caroline he'd carried silently for over a decade, showing me photographs of her as a teenager, sharing memories he'd never spoken aloud to another living person. It wasn't the secret I'd braced myself for walking into that room. It was something far more painful and far more human. A grief so enormous he'd built an entire hidden world just to have somewhere safe enough to hold it. The Whitmore House restoration finished the following spring, exactly as the plaque had predicted. Thomas asked me to help him plant a small garden outside it, something Caroline had apparently always wanted as a teenager and never got the chance to have. We didn't turn the house into anything elaborate. No memorial, no plaque with her name on it for strangers to read. Just a quiet, restored home standing where tragedy once took something from him, tended now by 2 people instead of 1. The locked door upstairs doesn't stay locked anymore. Some evenings, we sit in that room together, and Thomas still writes to Caroline sometimes, except now I sit beside him while he does it, finally sharing weight he spent 12 years insisting on carrying entirely alone. I used to think the scariest thing I'd ever discover behind a locked door would be a secret that ended my marriage. Instead, I found the exact opposite. A secret so quietly devastating that finally uncovering it together became the thing that made our marriage real for the first time.